All right, let's get started. I am Kimball Parker. I'm the CEO of SixFifty. For those of you who are hearing about SixFifty for the first time, we are the technology arm of the law firm Wilson Sonsini. So for those of you who don't know anything about the firm, Wilson Sonsini is one of the best law firms in the world. They helped found Apple and Google and brought them public. Same with Twitter, Lyft, SpaceX. The best, most exciting companies in the world use Wilson Sonsini to help them grow. So I want to back up. I just want to talk about the law generally. You know, in order to comply with certain laws, businesses need paperwork, lots of paperwork. They need policies, procedures, notices, contracts, etc. And those documents need to say the right thing. And if not, there are serious consequences. And that's especially the case during COVID. So what lawyers do is make sure that all of that legal paperwork says the right things. So lawyers just write documents all day. And so what we've done at SixFifty is we've worked with Wilson Sonsini to teach a computer to write legal documents like the best lawyers in the world. So our products are like TurboTax, but with the best lawyers in the world behind it. And the idea is to make the law more affordable and convenient so that anybody can afford the same quality of legal documents as Google. And we're going to be talking about one of those legal documents today, which is the Employee Handbook. And so our system can help companies write over 100 different types of legal documents. Okay, so today we are going to talk to you, like I said, about employee handbooks and really about kind of the legal challenges that a workforce that is more remote and mobile present, and how to account for those challenges in your employee handbook. So we have some interesting experience with this issue. Like I said, we automated an employee handbook, which includes over 65 different policies. And we did that with Wilson Sonsini. We took those policies, we tweaked all of them to make sure that they accounted for COVID. And then we made sure that they also account for the law in all 50 states. And then we automated it. And so anybody can use it. And so those policies cover everything from paid time off to video conferencing to discrimination. So everything that you need to cover, but with the kind of lens of COVID in there. So part of the reason why I'm telling you this is because you are going to hear from two of the main people who put those documents together with Wilson Sonsini. So the first is Ryan Parker. He's our Chief Legal Product Officer. He graduated near the top of his class from one of the best law schools in the nation, the University of Michigan, go Blue. He clerked for 2 judges, including one on the Third Circuit, the court right below the Supreme Court. And then he spent a decade working for the United States Justice Department, litigating some of the most high-profile cases handled by the government. And so a big part of his practice was employment law. And so we are lucky to pull him away to work with us here and to automate these important employment documents. The second person you're going to hear from is Marie Colbeth. Like Ryan, she graduated near the top of her class from one of the best law schools in the nation. She also clerked on the Federal Circuit, which is right below the Supreme Court, in the Fifth Circuit. She has worked in private practice. She taught at BYU Law School, and we actually pulled her away from BYU to come and to work with us. Marie is our chief evangelist and our GC, and so Marie and Ryan both work to automate that 50-state COVID accounted for employee handbook. And so prepare to be impressed by these two. So one last plug before we dive in. If you're interested in learning more about generating this employee handbook with us, please visit SixFifty.com/handbook, SixFifty.com/handbook. And that's where you can learn more about the product, schedule a demo, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two, we, I think, are going to ask some poll questions today. And so make sure to answer those. Those are always interesting. Finally, if you could put any questions into the Q&A button rather than the chat. So if you put it in the chat, it's not a big deal. It's just easier for us to catalog those questions and answer them when they're in the Q&A. So again, without any further ado, Ryan Parker and Marie Colbeth, take it away.
Thank you, Kimball, for your warm introduction. We're excited to be here for this webinar today. As Kimball mentioned, we've been helping companies in a number of different areas, including privacy. But on the employment side, we help companies with the return to work, but also in generating employee handbooks. And a lot of our webinar topics derive from questions that we get from customers. And we've had a lot of customers talk to us about some of the challenges they face as they transition to a hybrid workplace. And the challenges related to both COVID-19 and the return to the work site, but also developing a handbook that is situated to help facilitate a hybrid workplace. So we're going to touch on a number of different topics related to hybrid workplaces, COVID-19, and handbooks today. So let me just give you a quick roadmap for where we're heading. We're almost through with our introduction. Then we'll jump into what constitutes a hybrid workplace. What does that mean? What form can that take? Then we'll talk about vaccines in a hybrid workplace, health screening, and addressing concerns with returning to the workplace. And as I mentioned earlier, these different topics really, we decided to address them because of questions that we've received from customers and prospective customers who are thinking hard about these different issues. And then Marie will talk to us about updating your employee handbook for a hybrid workplace, how you can sort of transition from a traditional handbook to the type of handbook you need for a hybrid workplace. We'll talk about some policy trends, and then we're going to try to leave some time for some Q&A. And as Kimball mentioned, as we put in the chat, please put your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so that we can make sure that we answer those. We may also answer a couple of those as we go along if they're on topic, but we'll probably answer most of them during the Q&A before we wrap up. So let me jump right into what a hybrid workplace is. This is a term I think that has become sort of a hot one, a buzzword in workplaces. What is a hybrid workplace? What does it mean? Well, at its most simple level, a hybrid workplace is a flexible workplace model that can support both in-office and remote workers. And I think there were a lot of workplaces pre-pandemic that allowed employees to potentially telework one day a week. That was certainly my situation in the government for several years. I was able to telework one day a week, but I wouldn't call that a hybrid workplace. I think what we're looking at now is a situation where you have a whole bunch of employees who are teleworking. You have another group who are coming into the office. You have some that are coming to the office on Sundays, some days, and in teleworking on others. And so I want to just talk for a minute about some of the different forms of a hybrid workplace that we're seeing among our customers. The first is one in which certain groups are coming into a workplace and other groups are working remotely. And I think a lot of companies fall into this category. In our company, we find that our sales team and our customer success team are maybe more likely to come to the office. Our legal product team that Marie and I work with, I think is less likely to come into the office, in part because several of our employees work in locations where we don't have a physical office. They've been hired during the pandemic. But we talked to a customer the other day who was using a hybrid workplace model, and their model is that employees can work remotely on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, and are required to work in the office on Wednesdays and Thursdays. And they want people, the reason for that, they explained, is that they want people to be able to collaborate in person on at least a couple of days a week and to be able to schedule in-person meetings, knowing that their colleagues will also be in person, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about it. At the end of the day, really, the term hybrid workplace, I think, is an umbrella term that can encompass a lot of different arrangements that allow for some individuals to work remotely and other individuals to be in the office. And I think a large percentage of American businesses are moving to a hybrid workplace if they weren't there already. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges for companies that are adopting a hybrid workplace. And we'll start with sort of COVID-related challenges, and then we'll move more broadly to handbooks and the types of things that need to be done to prepare for this hybrid workplace. So I want to start with the issue that we get the most questions about, and I think it's one that's been on a lot of people's minds, and that's vaccinations. So there are, and I think this is something that companies across the country are struggling with. What do we do about vaccination policies? Most companies aren't including vaccination policies in their employee handbook, but they're certainly a really important part of a company's policy foundation. When it comes to vaccination policies, companies essentially have three options. And we're going to ask you a poll question in just a minute, but let me go over what these options are. Companies can require employees to be vaccinated to return to company work sites. And the EEOC has said that that generally is acceptable for companies to make that sort of requirement. The second option is that companies can encourage but not require employees to get vaccinated. And that comes in two different forms. Often, some companies are providing an incentive for their employees to be vaccinated, while other companies are encouraging but not providing an incentive. And the last is some companies are choosing not to adopt a vaccination policy. And so why don't we put up our first poll question here? We're interested to see where your company falls on this spectrum. And so if you'll just take a moment and check one of these boxes. One of the reasons we want to ask this question is we've done some polling in previous webinars several months ago, and I am interested to see kind of how the numbers are stacking up today with what we've seen as trends in the past. So we'll give you just another couple of seconds. How is your company addressing COVID-19 vaccinations? And it touches on those four options that we gave you: requiring to return to the office, encouraging without incentives, encouraging with incentives, or choosing not to adopt a COVID-19 vaccination policy. Why don't we close our vote here? Hope everyone's had a chance to vote and put our results up if we can. Very interesting. We have quite a spread here. We've got 26%, about a quarter, that are requiring employees to be vaccinated. And that's a pretty high number. That's consistent kind of with what we've seen. We then have a total of 41% who are encouraging their employees to be vaccinated. An overwhelming majority of those, 36% compared to 5%, are encouraging employees to be vaccinated without incentives. Only 5% of our respondents are encouraging employees to be vaccinated with incentives. I think that was a trend that was hot at the very several months ago when vaccination policies first came out, but it's sort of dropped off, and that's what our numbers would show. And then we have 33%, about a third, who are choosing not to adopt a COVID-19 vaccination policy. And that number's, I would say, a little higher than I expected. I think that's interesting. Well, one of the things that we have seen recently is a shift in the way that companies are thinking about vaccination policies. And that shift, I think, has been motivated by the numbers that we've seen that have come out of the spread of the Delta variant, as more and more people are getting COVID, as more ICU beds are being taken up. And I think some companies have revisited their vaccination policies. I also think, interestingly, that the federal government's decision to require federal employees to be vaccinated or undergo frequent testing, the military's decision to require vaccinations, that those decisions have affected some companies. And so I want to ask one additional poll question on this front about whether your company has changed its vaccination policy over the last couple of months. So let's put up that question. And one of the reasons that I want to ask this question is that at SixFifty, we have changed our vaccination policy. We had a policy that encouraged employees to be vaccinated. And with the spike in COVID cases that we've seen near our home office at Salt Lake City, we moved to a policy of requiring employees to be vaccinated for them to come into the office. Now, employees who are not vaccinated can continue to work remotely, but everyone who comes into the office has to be vaccinated. And we've told our employees that may not be a long-term policy, but it's one that we feel like we need to adopt based on the numbers that we're seeing in the area of our office. In other areas, and I live out in Maryland where our vaccination numbers are really high, we're seeing some different policies. So let's close this and see if we've had companies changing their vaccination. Interestingly, so we've had about a quarter of companies are in the same boat as us and have changed their vaccination policy over the last 2 months. And I think, we'll get to this as we summarize, but I think that's important for companies to continually monitor the situation that they're in and to think about how they can best protect their employees, customers, and suppliers, and that may require changes to policy. Let's move now to the next slide. This is another interesting issue that companies face when they're thinking about vaccination policies. And we had a quarter of our companies that responded to the poll who are requiring vaccinations. And then I believe it was 41% who are encouraging. Many companies who require and many companies who are encouraging vaccinations are collecting vaccination information from their employees. And there are multiple reasons for that. It can help with a risk analysis. If you're in California, for example, you need to know the vaccination status of your employees to determine whether they are required to wear masks or not in your work site. And so there are a lot of reasons why companies might collect vaccination information. And there are three basic options for doing that. The first is to require proof of vaccination. Usually that's a picture of a vaccination card, and to keep a copy of that card, or that proof, excuse me. The second option is to require proof of vaccination, but not to keep a copy. And that would usually involve your employees showing one of your HR professionals or whoever's administering your vaccination policy their vaccination card. They don't, your HR person doesn't keep a copy or take a picture of it. They just note that they've seen the proof and they mark that down. And then the last one is that a lot of companies are requiring employees just to sign a form attesting to their vaccination status without requiring proof of any kind. Companies trust their employees with all sorts of important information and material. And a lot of companies have said, we want to trust our employees with regard to their vaccination status. And so these three different ways of collecting employee vaccination information have some different pros and cons. And we're going to put a poll question up just to see what of these three people are using. I suspect that I have some hints as to what the results might be, but let's put up our question. How is your company collecting information about employee vaccination status? Are you requiring proof of vaccination and keeping a copy? That was the first option. Reviewing proof of vaccination, but not keeping a copy. Using a self-certification form. Another one we added here is some companies are collecting anonymized vaccination information, meaning they're having employees fill out a survey where they don't have to include their name. And that allows them to be able to get an understanding of their workforce and how many people are vaccinated. Some of these surveys also include asking people what offices or teams they work on so that they can understand, your company may want to know what percentage of the individuals who work in your loading dock are vaccinated. What about your call center? What about your retail space? And you can do that sometimes through anonymized vaccination data. And then obviously some companies are not collecting employee vaccination information at all. So if you could click on the one that best correlates to what you're doing at your company, why don't we close that and put up our results? Interesting. So this is not too surprising. Not collecting employee information, we have 44%. And we had about a quarter that don't have a vaccination policy. So I guess that's not super surprising that we'd have that many. We have 30%, a pretty high amount, almost a third, who are using self-certification forms. 9% who are reviewing proof but not keeping a copy. I'm surprised, a little surprised that that's so low. And about 16% that are requiring proof of vaccination and keeping a copy. There are some record retention issues that could come with keeping that copy, and I can see why some companies shy away from that just because they're creating additional medical records. But I think this is an interesting spread. I think what we can see from these three poll questions is that companies are addressing this vaccination issue in different ways. They're looking at their specific needs as a company and figuring out what works best for them. And it's not a one size fits all type of situation. And that companies are changing their approach as their situations change. And I think that's a real positive. Let's touch on our last vaccination slide as we talk about a hybrid workplace. It's interesting. If you're a hybrid workplace, those options don't change, but some of the considerations that you may want to weigh as you're setting your policies do change. And so a lot of companies that have a hybrid workplace have employees who work remotely all the time. They don't have in-person contact with coworkers or customers. Perhaps they live in an area where you don't have an office, for example. And that those employees are in a different situation in that they're not going to come into your office, they're not going to come in contact with others, and that may weigh differently as you're thinking about whether to require vaccinations for those types of employees. The second is that if people come to you, if you have a requirement that people be vaccinated, and you have employees come and request an accommodation because they have either a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccinated, as a company, as you're thinking about what those reasonable accommodations might be, certainly if you have a hybrid workplace, working from home is likely more likely to be upheld as a reasonable accommodation. And so maybe that makes it easier for companies to accommodate, but it also may put on them a requirement to provide that accommodation in those types of situations. Reasonable accommodations are a very tricky legal issue, and I'll just flag that as one. As you're thinking about those accommodations, I would highly recommend touching base with your counsel to walk through your decision-making process, because those can be very legally difficult questions. So we've touched on vaccinations. There's a lot there, but I hope that's been helpful as we've gone through the options and you've had some opportunity to see what some of the other companies on our webinar are doing. Let's move next to another issue that we get a lot of questions on, which is health screening and health screening policies. So health screening is required in a shrinking number of states. At one time, that list was pretty long, but I think at this point, we're down to essentially California, Nevada, Rhode Island, and Washington. And there are a couple of states that require health screening in specific industries. But interesting, so let's talk about what health screening is. It can usually be one of two things and sometimes used in combination. One is a questionnaire where employees are asked if they're experiencing symptoms, if they've tested positive, if they've come into close contact with someone with COVID-19. And based on their response, they're given clearance to either come to the office or not come in. And we help a lot of companies with a very easy health screener where we provide them with a URL that they can put in a Slack channel or use it in other ways, or put it into a calendar, and employees can fill it out in a matter of seconds, probably 30 seconds in the morning. And it clearly gives them direction whether to come in or not. And it creates a record for the company that they've screened everyone. The second thing they could do is temperature checks. And we've had a lot of companies that have someone down with a thermometer and they're just checking temperatures as people come in. Some companies ask their employees to take their temperature at home. And I think that that's interesting as well. But I would say the majority of companies that are doing screening are using the questionnaire, and it's a smaller group that are adding temperature checks. As I mentioned, there are two different ways to do the screening. You can have your employees do it at home, or you could do it when they get to the office. Personally, I think having them do it at home makes a lot of sense because no one wants to drive to the office and then be told that they have to drive back home. And it can be very efficient for employees to quickly be able to screen themselves. So I think there's some advantages there. If your company has questions about how well your employees are screening themselves, that may be a reason that you'd want to screen at your office location. The thing that's interesting, though, is as the number of states that require screening shrinks, we're seeing companies that are continuing to use health screening. And I'll give you an example. At SixFifty, we're currently using a health screener. So even though only vaccinated individuals can come to the office, we're also having them fill out a health screener so that they think through whether they're having symptoms and the other questions that we have to make sure that we're keeping our employee population safe. And I think, not every company is going to take that step, but I think it's an easy step that can go a long way.
And Ryan, I'm just going to hop in real fast on that. And because we did have a question come in, it was in the chat, so I don't know if you saw it, where they're just asking about whether, with using the screener, if companies are maybe seeing that there are problems with people taking advantage of it to get extra paid leave. It looks like a board member who's anxious that maybe their company is being overly generous because of the results of screeners. I think that's a really interesting question to ask. And part of my answer would be that it partially depends on where you are, right? Because in California, you have legal requirements. So even if you feel like maybe people are taking advantage of you, you're still legally required to offer certain amounts of leave based on the outcomes of those screeners. Whereas in other states, maybe you're starting to see employees take advantage of what you're trying to do to protect them, but that you're not legally obligated to do. And that's where maybe you might want to start thinking about, okay, well, are we giving leave? Or are we telling people work from home today? And how do we want to navigate that process? So that was my thought when I read the question.
Yeah, I think those are some great insights. And it's an interesting situation because in some cases, you're going to have individuals who have tested positive or they've come into contact with someone, but they're not having symptoms. And if you have a hybrid workplace, they can continue to work from home without any interruption. But if you have employees who are suffering from symptoms, obviously they're going to need to take leave. And most states, or many states, I should say, have enacted leave laws that would require them to use either their sick leave or special COVID-related leave for that. You know, I think these questions are hard, and it's similar when it comes to collecting vaccination information. Are employees telling you the truth? Are they taking advantage of the situation? I think that those can be difficult questions, and I would hope that we can trust our employees, that we have a company culture where that's not an issue, but sometimes that does become an issue. And I think those are the kind of things that a company is going to need to think about up front. I think there's some benefit on personally, as I've worked with different companies, to at least starting by trusting your employees and assuming that they're going to do the right thing and treat you fairly, just the way that you are trying to treat them. But I do think that issues can arise, and companies are smart to think through those issues.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'll just kind of tack on one more note. There was a question that came in that sort of attached to the earlier discussion about vaccinations. And it was jurisdictional specific, but I know the answer, so I'm going to go ahead and answer it.
Yeah.
Which is whether vaccines can be required at workplaces in Texas. The answer is yes. And I know that the answer is yes, because not only do we have our federal guidance saying that employers have the ability to make these sorts of decisions themselves, but there was a lawsuit in Texas. The Houston Methodist Medical Hospital implemented a vaccine mandate for their employees. And there was a lawsuit that came out of it. It went up on appeal, and it was determined that the employer was within its rights to implement that policy. So the short answer is yes. The more technical answer is, of course, you have to make sure that the policy you put in place meets all the legal requirements. You provide for accommodations the way that you have to for religious and medical reasons, and that you implement the policy in an appropriate way and all of those things. But the short answer is yes.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. And I think that's an interesting issue. The laws vary from state to state and sometimes from county to county on a lot of these different issues. And that's one thing that we try to do with our return to work tool set, is to help companies to be able to track all these different laws, especially for companies that have offices in different places. It can be very difficult to know what's going on in different office locations. And Texas certainly is a unique location when it comes to COVID-19. And it's been the site of a lot of interesting litigation and conflict between the state and local governments. So thanks, Marie. So I want to just touch on one more issue, and that's addressing concerns with returning to the workplace. And I think this is one that a lot of companies are wrestling with. Even as they've moved to a hybrid workplace, many companies want their employees to come into the office space for different events or for a couple of days a week, and are finding that they have employees who are concerned. And so I think there are a couple of best practices that we've seen emerge as we've been working with companies to help them to return to the workplace. The first is to listen to and work to understand employee concerns. It's sometimes easy, I think, to be dismissive of others' concerns as unreasonable or unfounded. But I think it's really important that employees feel listened to and understood when it comes to these issues. And I think it's helpful for me to have a reminder that people experience things differently. And even though I may be experiencing the pandemic in one way, other people may be experiencing it in other ways and have different experiences. And I think it's important to understand where those concerns come from. The second thing that I think is crucial is setting clear expectations. And that falls sort of into two basic buckets: for what employees can expect at the work site and for what you expect from your employees at the work site. And this is important for a lot of different reasons. One is that we all have different levels of risk tolerance, right? We make decisions about whether we're going to go to the store or whether we're going go to a restaurant, or the types of activities we're going to do based on our level of risk tolerance. And I think when things become difficult is when people don't understand sort of the level of risk that they're taking on. And so if you explain to your employees, hey, we have a policy where, for example, only vaccinated individuals are coming to the office and everyone has taken a health screener before they come, then your employees kind of have an idea of the level of risk involved with coming to the office. I think the problem comes when employees think that they're taking on one level of risk, and then when they get to your office space, they realize that there's more risk involved. And it's the same for your employees. It's important that they understand what you expect from them. If you're having all your employees wear masks in your work site, you need to be very clear about what those mask requirements are, so employees know when they come to the office what they need to do. They know that they need to, for example, go through a health screener or wear a mask or whatever the expectations are. And I think both of those things can help employees to feel more comfortable coming in, because they'll understand what protections are in place and what is expected of them. And a lot of those expectations can be set up clearly in a return to work policy, a policy that explains very clearly all the steps the company's taking and all the expectations for the employees. And I think as a best practice, creating a policy like that and sending it out to employees and having them acknowledge or sign that policy really sort of sets the table for making sure you have set and clear expectations. And then, this is something that we've touched on multiple times already, is companies need to continue to reevaluate their situation and policies. These should not be static policies. And I know that there are some costs associated with reviewing policies and sending them out for acknowledgement, but the situation here is changing drastically. And if you just think about kind of how much has changed in the last 4 months from when the CDC came out with new guidelines saying vaccinated people don't need to wear masks indoors and in most situations, to the change where the CDC came out again and said, actually, we recommend that vaccinated individuals do wear masks in indoor public places. That's a significant change. And if your policy has sort of remained static, you really may have missed, I think, some big changes to the situations that your company is facing and that your employees are facing. And so I think it's crucial that you continue to stay current on what's happening and the guidance that's coming from federal, state, and local authorities, and what's happening within your workforce. So, I think that will be a theme that we revisit again, even in the webinar, but it really is crucial that companies realize that this is a dynamic situation that's going to require some changing situations. As we talk about changes, we've thought about this webinar kind of in two parts. What is responsive to COVID and we hope may be somewhat temporary, and what is likely to kind of continue on as changes to the new way we work. And Marie's going to talk to us about some of the changes that we think are here to stay as we talk about policies and employee handbooks.
Thanks, Ryan. And I'll just say, coming off of that topic, as we have changed the policies at our company at SixFifty, I have seen how it has impacted the level of employee trust and their ability to feel comfortable with expectations. When we were in the stage where it's like, okay, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, but if you're not vaccinated, you do have to wear a mask. We had a really clear company policy about that, but a lot of people still felt very uncomfortable because it's like, well, do I need to remind that person of the rule, or should I just assume that they're vaccinated and they're doing the right thing? And while I had all the information because I was administering our policy, I knew who was vaccinated. Employees felt like some discomfort because it's like, well, I don't want to ask them, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable. And so like me, coming in and being very vocal about the fact that, yes, I'm on this, I'm covering this for you. I'm making sure that only vaccinated people are taking off their masks, that kind of thing. In some ways, this shift has been easier because it's like, okay, now if somebody's there, they're vaccinated because of it. And so like that expectation, that comfort, it really is dynamic even within the same workforce, even if you are being very vocal and very clear. So I've just seen that, with my own employees, level of comfort at different times during the pandemic under different policies that we've implemented. And that's something that when we talk about the carryover, what are we going to see continue? I think that that is honestly going to be a big one where we're now thinking about, what are the safety requirements that we want to have in our workforces, on an ongoing basis. Our employees are more aware of health issues within the workforce and how they impact one another. And we're more aware of a company of how our employees' health might be impacting the work. And so, are we going to have vaccination requirements, not just for COVID-19, but for other illnesses? Are we going to continue with health screeners? Because, maybe we've noticed a decrease in employee sick days because people aren't passing other sicknesses around the office. We're not just talking about COVID-19, but also this increased focus on employee well-being. I think the pandemic has taught all of us to be more aware of, our employees' mental health, of other stressors, of, additional stressors that we might be adding through, changes to the work, changes to policies we have in place. And so all of those things are going to continue on even when we're not in the pandemic stage, but also the changed work environment. We have an increase in remote work in the United States. We've seen an increase in relocation. So not only are your employees working remotely near your work sites, but some of them might have moved farther away. They might be in new states. Video conferencing. This is the new normal. I think a lot of us struggle to have regular conversations now. But we know how to video conference, and we love the fact that everybody's name is sitting there right on top of their picture. There's a few employees that I've only met, a handful of times in real life. And I was sitting there going, I wish we all had name tags. So, video conferencing and hoteling, if you're transitioning, if you've transitioned to a hybrid workforce, you might be in a situation where you're doing hoteling in your offices where, people can reserve a space and they can come in and have a desk that day, but that's not necessarily their desk every day because another employee might be using it 2 other days of the week. And so things like that are becoming more and more common, and they're kind of, they're the new normal. And all of those things together have created changed employee expectations. So when we're talking about retaining our workforce, when we're talking about recruiting new members to our workforces, we're going to have to keep these things in mind because these are now issues that, the workforce at large is attuned to. And so as we think about that, these things that have changed, the handbook becomes, much more important than it has been in the past. And keeping it up to date becomes much more important than it has been in the past. So whereas before, I think a number of companies were guilty of the same thing, which was, creating a handbook and then putting it on a shelf, pulling it out to show to somebody when they were onboarded, but never reviewing it. That was pretty common. But now we're seeing, with changes, you're going to have to be reviewing that handbook periodically. As far as, the COVID pandemic changes go, those might not all be making it into your handbook. They might be specific policies, but the handbook itself, we now see is helping us answer a lot of the questions that our employees have. Short-term disability, how does that leave work, in combination with other paid time off? Is it different in this state than in that state if I'm a company that has employees across multiple states? Those types of questions, your handbook can really help you answer. And there's also just new laws coming into play, I think at a much more rapid pace than we've been seeing in the past. One example that I was thinking about just this morning is that, this summer, New Hampshire's legislature passed a new family paid leave law that creates a voluntary paid leave program for employers with over 50 employees in New Hampshire. And it became the 9th state to pass a family paid leave law. Most of the other ones are mandatory, not voluntary, like New Hampshire's. And so, if you're in some of those states, you have different requirements for what's going into your handbook than what was required in the past, and than what's required in other jurisdictions. Other things that we're seeing go a lot more towards what we've already been talking about today, which is the increasingly remote workforces. So with an increasingly remote workforce, if you've seen Relocation and you now have employees in new states, those new states also have requirements. You can't just keep, if my employees were all, in the Salt Lake office and then they started moving out, I can't just keep regulating them according to the laws of Utah. I have to look at the laws of the states they've moved to, they've relocated to, and see if there's new requirements that I have to meet for those employees that I need to incorporate into my handbook. And finally, the final one is, changing requirements based on emerging employment issues and litigation. Probably the biggest one that we have seen recently was last year when the Supreme Court issued the Bostock decision. That's the one that found that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected by Title VII. And so, that's one that impacted everybody in terms of their non-discrimination policies. But we also have similar changes happening at state levels with different requirements. So this year in Massachusetts, the Supreme Court issued a decision clarifying that a commission is a wage under the Massachusetts Wage Act. So as soon as the employee completes the work, they have a right to that commission. So if you terminate somebody, say you previously had commission schedules where they earned their commission and they got paid at the end of the quarter, but they still had to be employed at the end of the quarter. In Massachusetts, that's no longer going to work. You can't keep that policy in place, because if you try to terminate the employee without paying their commission, they're actually entitled to triple damages, so triple commission, if you tried to do that. So a lot of things that may be incorporated into your handbook that are changing for a number of reasons. I'll give an example from our own company here at SixFifty with this question. Actually, could we advance the slide? Oh, you already did. Thanks. One of the things that's happening at SixFifty is, we've moved into a lot of new states during the pandemic. When we started, we had employees in 3 states. Now we have employees in 8 states. And so it was a really quick change in terms of which laws impacted what goes into our handbook. So in Utah, there's an immigration law policy that you have to comply with. But then I, moved into California, and a new requirement that I didn't have previously was that, I was required to have a lactation accommodation policy under California law. Well, when I moved into California, I didn't have enough employees to trigger their requirement for having a domestic violence leave policy. But when I moved into Nevada, their domestic violence leave policy was required if you had even 1 employee. So, just across just 3 of the jurisdictions that my company is in, there's differences in what I have to provide to my employees. And so, being able, SixFifty has this cool tool that we have as part of our handbook policy, where you can assess the states that you're in, and it'll tell you what's required, what's optional. And so as my company is contemplating hiring new employees, I'm able to use that tool to see, what policies might be required that we don't already have in place. Do we want to suscept ourselves to those rules and regulations? Do we maybe not want to go into those states? Those are all pretty big decisions that need to be made. And so a handbook can be used to help you, not just make those decisions, but make sure that as a company, you're following the requirements in the different states that you're in. So this is, to me, one of the really important things of having, a very up-to-date handbook in the changed work environment that we're seeing, and what we expect to be the continued, the new normal, if you want to call it that. So companies like us and our customers are using their handbooks, to serve as an employee resource, to set expectations in this new work environment, and to meet legal needs like the ones I was just describing, but also to create and strengthen company culture. And I do just want to spend a minute on that one. One of the things that I saw happen just in the last year that was really exciting to me is I had a number of employees come to me to tell me how much they appreciated a new policy we put into place. We put into place a parental leave policy. And, when it became official, I received a lot of feedback about it. And what was interesting was, as a tech company, we do what a lot of tech companies do, and we have sort of this unlimited time off policy where you can't abuse it, but we don't track it the way a lot of companies do, where it's, a get your work done environment. And so there had been sort of this thought like, well, do we need to do this? What will happen? Will it matter to employees since we already have this policy? And it mattered a lot. I feel like it had a big impact on culture. And basically it was employees saying like, yeah, we had that policy, but even with that kind of, unlimited policy, you don't really know what that means. And so when you have a really specific type of life event, like becoming a parent, it's really helpful to them to know what kind of support as a company we're offering to them. And so in terms of building company culture, it made a huge difference. So, your handbooks can have a big role there. And if you keep your handbooks up to date, you make sure that they're, helping employees know if some policies apply to them because of where they live, but other policies don't, and you're really clear, it can really help build those expectations, which goes back to a little bit of what Ryan was talking about with how we're seeing people react to different COVID policies. So to me, these are really key. And they're ones that I will attest, like I've seen them fulfill these needs in my own company. But there's also reasons you might not want to put things in your handbook. So while the handbook is something I absolutely advocate for, there's some things you're not going to want to put in there. And some of your policies are going to be so important that you want to treat them separately. Your handbook can end up being long. As Kimball mentioned at the beginning of the call, there's 65 different policies you could potentially choose to incorporate into your handbook if you use the SixFifty tool. That is a ton of information. You might have some policies that are so important that you just want to treat them separately so that they're really called out to the employees. Other things change so often that you don't want to have to update the employee handbook and have your employees re-acknowledge it every time. So your COVID policies would be a good example because the situation is changing so quickly. There also might be some policies that you have in place specifically to help the company deal with certain regulations or regulatory bodies that you want to treat separately. And then sort of related to the question of how big is your handbook going to be, if you have too much in there, it might get confusing for employees. So, you have some policies that are very specific to certain employees, in certain jurisdictions or that kind of thing. Maybe you want to, a la carte, have those employees receive those and sign and acknowledge those. Or maybe you don't want your employees to see like, the New Hampshire and the Oregon and the California and Louisiana version of the policies that might apply. You just want them to see their version. So you might choose like, okay, we're not going to put all of those into the handbook. We're going to send the right copy to the right employees. So there's reasons you might not want it all in one huge document. And that being said, the handbook itself has a lot of value, and I would definitely advise that you consider getting yours up to date, making sure that it meets the requirements of the different jurisdictions.
And
so,
Marie,
yeah,
I was just going to jump in. We had an interesting question come in through the comments where someone asked sort of about, I guess, the form and format of a handbook, what our thoughts are on, instead of having sort of a formal handbook, having almost like a library of independent policies that can be updated independently of sort of a standalone handbook. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And I actually think that that's where handbooks are going, as there more and more handbooks are being hosted online and in different formats where things can be updated specific to the parts that need to be updated without touching the rest of the handbook, and maybe are more easily navigated. And so I think, all the things you've said about a handbook, I think still apply to this idea of having maybe a policy library is what we call ours. We've taken our employee handbook essentially and broken it into its component parts so that companies can go in and pick and choose what they want, like ordering a la carte instead of getting a combo meal. And I think it's the same idea with having sort of a library of policies. And that in some ways might make it easier to slide COVID-19 or a masking or a screening policy in and out of a policy library without having it, affect the rest of the policies. And I think also acknowledgements, right? There's always this question about, do we need an acknowledgement if we make a change to one policy or if we move something in and out? And I think, that's maybe a question for another day and a complicated one. But what are your thoughts about breaking a handbook up into almost separate policies within a library format?
Yeah, I would agree that that's really helpful, and for the reasons that we just sort of went over. A big thing, if you're going to do that, is to remember notification, right? If you have a change or a new policy, acknowledgement, but also in terms of internal referencing and agreement. If you have people coming in and they're signing their at-will employment agreements, or you're referencing things in their offer letters, that are referencing an employee handbook. Even if you've broken it into its component parts and it's really your library, you just want to make sure that you're using consistent messaging so that what they're agreeing to and what you're promising to hold them to match. So calling it your policy library instead of calling it your employee handbook, like, just make sure that you're using good nomenclature so that it's consistent and people are held to the standard and can't say, oh no, I only agreed to follow the handbook. I signed that. I didn't agree to all these other policies that you just snuck in later. So just make sure you use good labeling and get, clear communication out when it's updated and have them acknowledge the updates in whichever format you're using. Great question. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move through just a couple of points. You'll get the slides, so you'll have a chance to think about these things in more depth, and I'm going to hit them. Just that with changes, again, things that are going to stay changed, we think remote work is a big one of them. You're going to need policies in place to enable your workforce to be more remote. It might be a permanent issue, or it might be just in response, right? You might need to be remote at different points in time because of responding to future disasters, whether they're health-based, like the current one, climate-based. You might also want to be able to accommodate or create reasonable accommodations for people who are immunocompromised at the current time during the pandemic, but also under the ADA, where, before, if somebody asked for an accommodation under the ADA, it might not have been expected that offering them remote work would be considered a reasonable accommodation. That's changed. If your workforce has gone remote during COVID, you're probably going to need to be able to offer that as an accommodation, even when your workforce is back in the office. So that's probably a change to think about, but also think about it in terms of incentives and standard operating procedures. This is something that is, it will help people. There's a bit of a housing crisis going on in a lot of the country right now. If you can, allow people to work remotely, reduce commute needs, they can live maybe a little further away from the work site than they could otherwise. That sort of need ties directly into relocation as well. So in addition to letting people work away from the work site, sometimes maybe have a hybrid situation, we're also looking at the potential of having employees relocate. If you can advance by 2 slides, I'm just gonna skip a little bit so we can get everything in. So relocation, we've talked a little bit about today, but we are seeing an increase in it in the United States. But you need to have policies in place so that you can decide, who is eligible to relocate. Are there states that we will pre-approve? Are there other jurisdictions that we're going to say no to ahead of time? Create those employee expectations and let them know how the decisions will be made, so that if they ask, and if your answer is no, that's when you might get pushback from employees. And you want to be able to say that you're following policy and procedure, and make it the kind of decision that has less arbitrariness to it, so that you can avoid potential discrimination problems. And so that's a big one. And growing out of both of these things, there's a lot of new policy trends in terms of employee policies that you should be thinking about putting in place. Again, we're getting near the end of the time, so I'm just going to hit a couple of these. A big one is your technology systems. People are working from home. What type of technology are they using? What type of controls are you putting on it for security purposes? Are you giving them access to, company computers? If you're doing that, how are you controlling what they use it for? Also, we're looking at, one question that I get a lot is, video conferences. How do we, sort of control what's happening on the video conferences? What our employees are doing with the video conferencing technology? A big one is recording. We're recording today's webinar, but different states have different recording laws in terms of whether you have to have the agreement of just one party, or you have to have the agreement of everyone who's being recorded. And so with those differences, you don't expect your employees to know the state-by-state rules. That's sort of it's unlikely you're going to have employees who know, and you might not always know where the people are that are joining your call. They might be in Rhode Island, they might be in Europe. You might not know. So, putting policies in place to keep, things secure, to tell your employees when they are and aren't allowed to record. All those types of situations are covered by good employment policies. And so again, like we kind of got too close to the end of time to go into this in depth. So we'll just sort of do a bit of a wrap up now. Sort of some takeaways that we just want everybody to think about, providing strong leadership and building a culture, even if your workforce is more remote, can be done through strong handbooks and strong policies, and acting proactively so that you're ahead of changes that you can see coming, instead of having to fix things, to go back, to make decisions in one-off situations. Those are all going to be helpful, but the most helpful thing really is to have the policies, but to communicate them clearly and to have them be things that are supportive, not just of your obvious bottom line, but also the health and wellness of your employees. I think that's a big change that we do need to make sure is part of our approach to all of this, for a lot of different reasons. But one of the main ones is you want to retain your employees, you want to build them, and you want them to grow with the company. And so for that to be possible, you need to keep them in mind as you decide which policies to put in place.
Yeah, I really like these 2 points of emphasis. And I think there are kind of 2 points that we've hit on throughout the webinar, of the importance of clear communication with our employees, especially during these somewhat uncertain times and times of challenge. And then the importance of health and wellness, of focusing on the health and wellness of employees and prioritizing that. I think those are both, big takeaways to what we're seeing as points of emphasis in this new hybrid workplace, where employees may not be in the office, and we need to make sure that we're really clearly communicating expectations, culture, and that we're focused on their health and wellness. Marie, do you think we have just a minute to hit? I think we have a few questions. Should we try to answer those in the Q&A?
Yeah, I think if people want to leave, we absolutely understand, but we're going to go ahead and answer the remaining questions. And so if you've got to go, maybe just listen to the end of the recording when it gets emailed out.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Marie. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really enjoyed the conversation. We hope you'll join us for future webinars. We'll answer, we have 3 questions here. I'll start with the first one, Marie. What do you think about this? Is the reasonable accommodations, does that mean that the company needs to support working remotely financially for laptops and internet? So I think that question is like, if the reasonable accommodation is them working at home, what does that require of the company?
Yeah, the answer there is that it'll be fact specific, fact dependent. So there's your lawyer answer. Yeah. The more clear answer for this specific question is, yes, you're going to have to do something that will cost the company money, like some sort of financial input will be there. Just remember, you'd be providing them some sort of technology if they were on site as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a laptop though. I've seen companies, send a tech out to install a desktop. And so it's like, here's the cost of sending a tech. Here's the cost of the desktop. Like the actual specific financial costs might be different, but there will be some costs associated with it. And that's, again, the reason it's fact specific is when we are talking about reasonable accommodation law, the word reasonable is based on the facts. So if the cost of having somebody work from home is exponentially higher than the cost of having somebody come into your work site, it may not be reasonable in your situation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Marie. That's what I was going to say as well, is that, the cost of having someone work at home might make it unreasonable if, it's much higher than working at the office. And so that is very fact specific. I agree with everything that you said. This is sort of similar. If you require at-home temp checks, does the company need to provide the thermometers for them to use at home? And that's an interesting question. And it's one that I have not heard in the past about at-home temperature checks. I would say that if that's a requirement for the company, that it would certainly be a best practice to provide those thermometers, and that I think there's a chance that could be legally required as well if you're going to require people to do those temperature checks before they come in. What do you think, Marie?
Yeah, if somebody, my takeaway would be, if somebody says, I don't have a thermometer, your response either needs to be, we're sending you one, or, okay, we'll do yours at the office. So you have to have a plan in place, because you can't have a requirement like that would cost the employee money where you don't either reimburse the employee. You could say, get your own, we'll reimburse you. It's, you know, required for your job. You need this piece of equipment. So you could do it through a reimbursement policy. You could send them the equipment, or you could have a backup plan in place for those employees that says, you know, you can alternatively get a temperature check at the office. Temperature checks at the office have a lot of additional requirements around them. So I would look at something more like reimbursement as your go-to option.
Yeah, I agree. As usual, we're on the same page again on that one, Bree. And
Ryan and I share a brain.
Yeah.
We've talked about all of these things a lot.
We have talked to these issues, both for our company and for customers. So not too surprising. And our final question is, I'm curious if you have insights on addressing employees that refuse to be vaccinated. And I've tried to give you the hard ones to take the first chop at. So I'll take the first one on this. You know, you always want to be thoughtful before you would end an employee's employment. But the EEOC has been pretty clear that that companies in general can require individuals to be vaccinated in order to come into the work site. And so if an employee just refuses to be vaccinated, not for a protected reason, meaning not because of a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief, I think companies are generally on pretty firm ground for ending that employee's employment with the company. You know, that's not something I think employers should take lightly. I think it's a tough legal market. I think you want to take care of your employees, but there are good reasons why companies may want everyone to be vaccinated at their work site, and there are many employees that have to work at the work site. And so I think that the guidance we've seen from the EEOC puts companies on pretty strong grounds to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy and ultimately to separate employees who refuse to be vaccinated.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Ryan. Again, a lot of it's just about making sure you check all the boxes and do it the right way at that point. But again, going back to the Houston Methodist example, after they won that court case, 150 employees, which sounds like a lot, but they have thousands, like more than 20,000 employees, 150 either resigned or were let go because they refused to be vaccinated. So, you know, it is a real thing that you are allowed to do, but you want to make sure that you're doing it, like Ryan said, thoughtfully. I would say with the advice of counsel, especially the first time, if it looks like you might have to do it multiple times, make sure that you get the process down, and you know, try to be encouraging to your employees first. I would say, from sort of my HR hat role, like, see if you can understand why they have hesitations. If those reasons are ones that, you know, you might be able to provide an accommodation for, look at what that might be. Like, you know, think through all of those things first before you go the route of termination. But, you know, you do have that right as the employer if they're not willing to follow your policy.
And just to give a little further help to our friend who asked that question, I just put in the chat a link to the EEOC's guidance, and they have a Q&A in there where they answer a similar question. And so that may be helpful if you want to click on that link. I just put it in the chat. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I know we've gone a little over time, but I think these have been some interesting questions. I'm impressed with the way that people are thinking through these issues, and we've really enjoyed discussing them with you. We hope that you'll join us on future 650 webinars. We really enjoy these conversations that we have together. And if you feel like we might be able to help you as you generate policies or as you're working towards bringing employees back to the workplace, feel free to check us out at 650.com or to click on the link that's been shared in the chat, which I believe is 650.com/handbook. So thank you for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Bree.